At exactly 8:17 p.m. on a Thursday evening, my father casually discussed how to divide my 2,147,000 estate after I was gone. The strange part wasn't the number. It was how calm I felt when I heard it. The mahogany grandfather clock in my parents' dining room chimed twice as I paused outside the partially closed door. Crystal glasses clacked softly against polished wood. Laughter echoed through the room. They were planning my life after my death. And they had absolutely no idea that I was standing 10 feet away listening to every word. Before I tell you what happened next, comment below where you're watching from and hit subscribe, because what my family did next left even me speechless. I remained motionless in the hallway. My dark-skinned reflection stared back from a framed mirror beside the staircase. For 31 years, I had been the invisible daughter. The responsible one. The provider. The one expected to solve problems while receiving none of the praise. My younger sister, Ava, never carried those expectations. She never had to. Well, my mother said, her voice floating through the doorway, the investment accounts alone should cover everything. My stomach tightened. Not from fear. From curiosity. Because the accounts they were discussing represented only a fraction of what I actually owned. What they didn't know was that my real net worth had quietly passed $8,400,000 6 months earlier through a series of acquisitions connected to my consulting firm. The $2,147,000 they were counting wasn't even close. That house should go to Ava, my father said. Ava laughed. I mean, obviously. The arrogance in her voice rattled something deep inside me. Not enough to lose control. Just enough to sharpen my attention. A cold biting fury settled beneath my ribs. The conversation continued. So when the doctors confirm it, my mother said, everything will already be organized. My chest stopped moving for a second. Doctors? I hadn't seen a doctor in months. I was perfectly healthy. I listened harder. The chandelier above the dining table cast warm light across the room. I could see part of my father's tailored suit through the opening in the door. She never needed much anyway, Ava said. Exactly, my father replied. She's always worked. Always handled herself. There it was. The family logic I had lived under my entire life. Because I survived without help, I deserved none. Because I succeeded alone, my sacrifices became invisible. My knuckles turned white around the strap of my handbag. Still, I remained silent. Glacial. Observing. Calculating. The more they spoke, the more obvious it became that they weren't speculating. They were certain. Certain enough to discuss percentages. Certain enough to discuss property transfers. Certain enough to discuss my death as though it were already scheduled on a calendar. Then Ava asked the question that changed everything. So when do we tell her? Silence followed. A heavy silence. Then my mother answered. Not yet. My pulse slowed. Not sped up. Slowed. Because in that moment I understood something important. They weren't reacting to information. They were hiding information. The silence was absolute. And suddenly, only one question mattered. Why were they so certain I was about to die? The question followed me home that night. Why were they so certain I was about to die? I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice repeating, not yet. By 6:12 a.m. the next morning, I was sitting in my pristine downtown apartment overlooking the city skyline. A coffee machine hummed softly behind me. The smell of roasted beans filled the cool air. My laptop screen glowed across a crystal desk organizer while I reviewed financial reports worth millions. On paper, I was the most successful person in my family. Yet somehow, I had always been treated as the least important. That contradiction wasn't new. It had started when I was a child. I grew up hearing subtle comparisons disguised as compliments. Ava's lighter skin was beautiful. Her curls were soft. Her smile was special. Meanwhile, I was strong. I was independent. I was responsible. Words that sounded positive until I realized they were being used as excuses to give me less. Less attention. Less protection. Less love. By 16, I was working after school while Ava received spending money. By 22, I was helping cover utility bills. By 28, I had quietly paid nearly $186,000 toward family expenses. No one thanked me. They expected it. My mother especially. Whenever I hesitated, she weaponized family loyalty. Family takes care of family. You know your sister needs help. God blessed you so you could bless others. The requests never stopped. Neither did the withdrawals. What they didn't know was that every dollar I gave was documented. Every transfer. Every payment. Every sacrifice. I tracked everything. The habit came naturally to me. I thought in contracts, numbers, and risk assessments. That habit would eventually save me. 3 days after overhearing the conversation, my parents hosted a dinner gathering. The house looked exactly as I remembered. Mahogany furniture. Crystal centerpieces. The massive chandelier hanging above the dining room table. Everything polished. Everything designed to project status. As guests arrived, laughter echoed through the house. Then my father's voice carried across the room. There she is. I turned toward him. Standing beside my parents and Ava was a tall white man wearing a tailored navy suit. His smile appeared practiced. Too perfect. Too rehearsed. Ava's friend, Richard, my father said proudly. The admiration in his voice was impossible to miss. Richard extended his hand. I've heard a lot about you. Something about the statement felt strange. I shook his hand anyway. His grip tightened slightly. Not enough to be aggressive. Just enough to establish dominance. A calculated move. Ava immediately stepped closer to him. Richard manages investment opportunities, she said. Very successful ones. My mother smiled. He's brilliant. My father nodded. One of the smartest businessmen we've ever met. The worship was immediate. Almost embarrassing. Richard accepted it without hesitation. That caught my attention. People with real power rarely need constant validation. People pretending to have power usually do. As dinner continued, I watched him carefully. Every answer sounded polished. Every story sounded rehearsed. Every accomplishment sounded slightly exaggerated. The silverware clacked against plates. The chandelier light reflected across crystal glasses. And beneath all the polished confidence, something rattled my instincts. Something didn't fit. Something about Richard simply didn't add up. Something about Richard simply didn't add up. That feeling stayed with me long after the dinner ended. For years, my success had depended on recognizing risk before everyone else saw it. Numbers rarely lied. Patterns rarely lied. People lied constantly. And Richard felt like a lie. 3 days later, I found myself seated across from him at another family gathering. Crystal glasses clacked softly around us while conversations echoed through the dining room. The chandelier above cast warm light across the polished mahogany table. Richard loved attention. More importantly, he expected it. My father practically hung on every word. Ava looked at him like he was royalty. My mother treated him as though he had personally descended from heaven to improve our family. Then Richard turned his attention toward me. So, he said, swirling his drink, you're still doing consulting work? The emphasis on the word still wasn't accidental. I smiled politely. I am. He nodded slowly. Interesting. The room grew quieter. I've always found consulting fascinating. Advising people without actually controlling capital. A few guests laughed. Richard continued. Real wealth comes from acquisitions, venture structures, leveraged growth models. That's where serious players operate. There it was. Step 1. Publicly mock my career. My father immediately joined in. Richard manages opportunities on a completely different level. Ava grinned. He's teaching me so much. I simply listened. Glacial. Calm. Observing. Richard wasn't talking to impress me. He was performing for an audience. And performers eventually make mistakes. What they didn't know was that I had already begun looking into him. The next morning, I started digging. At first, everything looked impressive. Professional website. Luxury branding. Photographs of private jets. Corporate registrations. Awards. Success stories. Exactly the image he wanted people to see. Then I started verifying details. The first irregularity appeared at 10:43 a.m. One executive credential couldn't be confirmed. At 11:17 a.m., a second certification failed verification. By 2:14 p.m., 3 separate professional claims had completely collapsed. My pulse remained steady, but my attention sharpened. I kept going. The deeper I searched, the stranger things became. Company addresses led to virtual offices. Board memberships didn't exist. Investment partnerships dissolved under scrutiny. Several businesses showed unusual financial activity. Then I found something far more troubling. Missing money. Large amounts. Transfers that appeared legitimate on the surface, but vanished through layers of shell entities. Not thousands. Hundreds of thousands. The discovery sent a cold current through me. I leaned back from my desk. The city skyline stretched beyond the pristine glass windows of my office. Below me, traffic hummed. Inside, silence settled. Completely oblivious to the fact that his carefully constructed image was unraveling, Richard continued charming my family. But now I understood something. This wasn't simple exaggeration. This wasn't vanity. This wasn't harmless deception. People had lost money. Real people. Families. Retirees. Small business owners. Innocent victims. And the more documents I uncovered, the more obvious it became that Richard's operation extended far beyond a few fake credentials. My knuckles turned white around a printed report. The fraud wasn't just larger than I expected. It was bigger than I had imagined possible. The fraud wasn't just larger than I expected. It was bigger than I had imagined possible. For several days, I kept my discoveries to myself. I gathered records, verified documents, and built timelines. Every new file strengthened my suspicions. Yet, despite everything I was uncovering, the real blow came from my own family. The humiliation arrived on a Saturday evening. My parents were hosting another gathering at their house. Crystal glasses clacked beneath the glow of the chandelier. Laughter echoed through the pristine dining room. The smell of expensive food drifted through the air. I arrived wearing a tailored black suit that reflected exactly who I had become. Successful. Disciplined. Self-made. Invisible. Richard was already holding court at the center of the room. As usual, my father looked impressed. As usual, Ava looked proud. As usual, my mother looked at me as though my presence required explanation. Then Richard smiled. Naomi's consulting career is adorable. Several guests chuckled. I remained still. Glacial. He continued. I suppose somebody has to advise the people who actually create wealth. More laughter. My father joined in. She's always been practical. The statement landed harder than Richard's insult. Because my father knew exactly what I had accomplished. He simply chose not to acknowledge it. Ava leaned forward. Richard closed a deal worth more than anything Naomi has ever worked on. The words echoed through the room. My mother nodded approvingly. Everyone has different levels of success. That sentence did it. Not because it hurt. Because it clarified everything. For years I had funded emergencies. Paid bills. Solved problems. Protected people who never intended to stand beside me. And now they were applauding a man I suspected was stealing from innocent families while treating me like a footnote. They thought they were winning. Completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath them was already cracking. I left without arguing. Without defending myself. Without a single dramatic scene. The front door closed behind me with a heavy thud. An hour later, I stood alone inside my apartment. The city lights glowed through floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence felt enormous. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to stop moving. No work. No planning. No rescuing. Just truth. I walked toward the mirror in my bedroom. My reflection stared back. Dark skin. Tired eyes. Jaw set tight. A lifetime of sacrifices looked back at me. My chest was heaving. My hands felt clammy. Years of suppressed disappointment settled around me like weight. Then something shifted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Quietly. Permanently. The cold biting fury that had lived inside me for years suddenly became razor-sharp focus. I looked directly into my own eyes. And I finally said the words I had needed to hear. The daughter disappeared that night. The strategist remained. The silence afterward felt different. Lethal. Because from that moment forward, I stopped asking what my family thought of me. I started asking what they didn't know. Then, at exactly 7:06 a.m. the next morning, my phone began to ring. The caller's name changed everything. The caller's name changed everything. I stared at my phone as it vibrated across the crystal countertop of my kitchen. Samuel Brooks, my grandfather's attorney. For a moment, I simply watched the screen glow. My grandfather had been gone for almost 3 years. Yet his influence had never completely disappeared. Unlike the rest of my family, he had always seen me clearly. Not as the responsible daughter. Not as the dark-skinned granddaughter expected to endure more and receive less. He saw potential. At exactly 7:06 a.m., I answered. Mr. Brooks. His voice remained calm. Naomi, I need to see you immediately. My pulse slowed. That tone meant something important. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The call ended. By 7:48 a.m., I stepped into his downtown office. The reception area was pristine. Mahogany shelves lined the walls. Morning sunlight reflected across polished surfaces. Everything felt deliberate, controlled, permanent. Much like the man waiting for me. Samuel stood when I entered. Without wasting time, he placed a sealed envelope on the conference table. The thick paper landed with a soft thud. Then he looked directly at me. Your grandfather instructed me to deliver this only if certain conditions were met. A chill moved through me. What conditions? His expression hardened. Evidence of financial exploitation involving your family. The room became very quiet. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had spent decades building wealth while studying people. He trusted documents more than promises, records more than emotions, proof more than loyalty. And apparently, he had prepared for something exactly like this. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were multiple legal files, trust agreements, property ownership records, corporate documents, transfer authorizations. My eyes moved rapidly across the pages. Then I saw the numbers. Assets valued at $12,860,000. My breath caught. Not because of the amount. Because of the ownership structure. Everything had been placed inside a protected trust. Controlled entirely by me. My parents weren't beneficiaries. Neither was Ava. They had absolutely no idea. Samuel slid another file toward me. This is the important one. I opened it. Immediately, my stomach tightened. Bank records. Transaction histories. Shell companies. Wire transfers. The same names I had uncovered during my investigation into Richard. Only this file went deeper. Much deeper. Several innocent investors had lost retirement savings. Family businesses had collapsed. College funds had disappeared. The fraud wasn't merely financial. It was devastating lives. A cold, biting fury settled inside me. Not emotional. Strategic. Lethal. Richard wasn't just lying to my family. He was using them. Using their obsession with status. Using their desperation to appear connected to wealth. Samuel folded his hands. Your grandfather suspected someone like Richard would eventually appear. I looked up. You mean he planned for this? Samuel nodded slowly. He planned for you. The words echoed through the room. For years, I had carried everything alone. Now I understood something important. I hadn't been abandoned. I had been prepared. The final document rested at the bottom of the stack. A single signature line waited near the bottom page. Samuel tapped it gently. The sound rattled through the silence. If you sign this, Naomi, the entire process begins. I stared at the page. At the power it contained. At the future it promised. And at the destruction it would unleash. Because one signature could change everything. One signature could change everything. I signed the document at 9:43 a.m. that morning. The sound of the pen moving across paper was almost disappointingly quiet considering how much power it released. Samuel collected the documents without celebration. Neither of us needed dramatic speeches. We both understood what had just begun. 3 days later, my parents invited me to another family dinner. I accepted immediately. Not because I wanted to be there. Because strategy often requires proximity. That evening, I arrived wearing a tailored charcoal suit and silver earrings. The outfit felt less like clothing and more like armor. The woman stepping through that doorway was no longer searching for approval. She was collecting information. The dining room looked exactly as it always had. Mahogany table, crystal glasses, pristine silverware, the enormous chandelier glowing overhead. Everything polished. Everything designed to imitate permanence. What they didn't know is that several foundations beneath their carefully constructed world were already beginning to crack. Dinner started normally, at least on the surface. Plates clacked softly. Conversations echoed around the room. Wine glasses chimed together. Then Richard began. He always did. "I was reviewing market performance this morning," he announced loudly. Several people turned toward him. My father leaned forward immediately. Ava smiled. Richard glanced in my direction. "You know, consulting is fascinating because it lets people feel connected to important decisions." A few guests laughed. I continued eating. Slowly. Silently. His smile tightened. But actually managing serious capital requires a completely different skill set. More laughter. I lifted my glass. Nothing else. The silence lingered. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. The first crack appeared. Most arrogant people expect resistance. Resistance validates their importance. What they don't know how to handle is indifference. I gave him exactly that. He tried again. Of course, not everyone is built for high-level financial strategy. I took another sip of water. No response. Not even a facial expression. The chandelier hummed softly above us. The room temperature felt cool against my skin. Across the table, I noticed Richard's fingers tapping. Then tapping faster. His confidence was beginning to rattle. My father attempted to help. "Richard's portfolio management experience is impressive." Still nothing from me. Ava added, "Some people are comfortable staying small." Silence. Absolute silence. My silence. And it was working. The absence of a reaction became the center of the room. People began watching Richard instead of listening to him. That changed everything. His jokes became forced. His stories became longer. His need for validation became obvious. By dessert, tiny details were emerging. Contradictions. Exaggerations. Numbers that didn't quite match previous stories. Completely oblivious to the fact that his own insecurity was exposing him, Richard kept talking. And talking. And talking. The more he spoke, the more uncomfortable he became. The more uncomfortable he became, the more mistakes he made. I sat perfectly still. Glacial. Razor sharp. Watching. Because for the first time, Richard wasn't controlling the conversation. He was fighting against the silence. And the silence was winning. By the end of the evening, I noticed something that made me almost smile. Richard had started making mistakes. Dangerous ones. He was about to put himself on a stage. In front of witnesses. And he had no idea what was waiting for him there. The gala took place on a Friday evening at exactly 7 p.m. By the time I stepped into the ballroom, every piece of the trap was already in motion. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen constellations. Light reflected across polished marble floors. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays while conversations echoed through the enormous room. This was Richard's favorite environment. An audience. Status. Admiration. People willing to believe appearances. I arrived wearing a tailored black suit with sharp silver accents. The fabric fit perfectly. The outfit felt less like evening wear and more like battle armor. Calm settled over me like a second skin. Across the room, I spotted my parents and Ava. They looked proud. Excited. Certain. My father straightened his jacket every few minutes. My mother smiled at anyone willing to listen. Ava stood beside Richard as if she were already sharing his success. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. The ballroom filled with attorneys, investors, executives, auditors, and industry leaders. Many of them already possessed pieces of the evidence. They simply didn't know when those pieces would become public. At 8:14 p.m., Richard took the stage. Applause echoed through the room. His smile widened. His confidence looked limitless. For a moment, I almost admired it. Then he began speaking. "I've spent my career identifying opportunities others fail to recognize." More applause. He continued. Success comes from understanding complex financial ecosystems, leverage structures, and advanced capital deployment. The jargon flowed effortlessly. Designed to impress. Designed to intimidate. Then his eyes found me. There it was. The moment he couldn't resist. Richard smiled. Unfortunately, some people spend their lives advising while others actually create wealth. A few people laughed. He wasn't finished. Consultants often mistake observation for leadership. His gaze remained fixed on me. Some individuals should be grateful they're allowed near successful people. The room shifted slightly. People sensed the tension. Richard mistook that tension for victory. What he didn't know was that every insult moved him closer to disaster. I remained seated. Silent. Glacial. The same silence that had rattled him weeks earlier. He took another step. The worst one. If certain people continue interfering with business matters they don't understand, they'll find themselves facing consequences. There it was. The threat. Public. Recorded. Documented. Exactly as expected. My pulse never changed. My hands never moved. Across the ballroom, several investigators exchanged brief glances. An attorney closed a folder. An auditor checked his watch. The timing had arrived. Richard raised his glass. He thought he had won. Then the first screen behind him flickered. A soft electronic hum filled the room. Richard paused. The massive display changed. A corporate registration document appeared. Then another. Then another. The audience grew quieter. Richard frowned. The presentation continued automatically. Bank transfers. Shell companies. Transaction records. False credentials. Exact timestamps. Verified signatures. Every document connected directly to him. The color drained from his face. Ava's smile disappeared. My father's expression froze. My mother's glass slipped from her fingers and struck the table with a sharp clack. Nobody laughed now. Nobody applauded. The evidence kept appearing. Page after page. Record after record. Proof after proof. The ballroom seemed to shrink around him. For the first time all evening, Richard looked uncertain. Then worried. Then afraid. The final document appeared on the screen. And the room fell completely silent. The final document appeared on the screen. And the room fell completely silent. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The crystal chandeliers above seemed frozen in place. The ballroom's usual hum had vanished. Even the clink of silverware stopped. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the massive display behind Richard. The final document was devastating. A complete transaction summary. Verified. Timestamped. Authenticated. Every transfer connected directly to accounts under Richard's control. Every missing dollar had a trail. Every trail ended in the same place. Him. I watched the realization spread across the room. Slowly. Then all at once. Richard's face turned pale. His confident posture collapsed almost instantly. The tailored suit that had once projected authority now looked like a costume. For the first time since I had met him, he appeared exactly what he was. A frightened man. Then he made the mistake that destroyed everything. He started talking. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. The microphone amplified every word. His voice echoed across the ballroom. Several guests exchanged glances. Richard pointed toward the screen. Those transactions were temporary positioning movements. Nobody responded. He continued. "You people don't understand advanced capital structuring." There it was again. The jargon. The performance. The desperate attempt to sound smarter than everyone around him. Only this audience wasn't my family. This audience included auditors, attorneys, compliance specialists, financial investigators, people who understood exactly what they were seeing. Richard kept speaking. Each sentence made things worse. "You have no idea how modern wealth preservation works." An investigator near the front row slowly stood. Richard didn't notice. The money was never stolen. Another investigator stood. Then another. The audience began shifting in their seats. A nervous energy rattled through the room. Richard finally saw them. Too late. Far too late. One investigator stepped forward. "We have evidence that investor funds were diverted through 14 shell entities." Richard laughed nervously. The sound felt hollow. That's not illegal. An attorney immediately responded. Those entities were never disclosed. The silence afterward was brutal. Richard's chest was heaving now. His hands trembled. The mask was gone. My father suddenly stood. There's been some misunderstanding. Nobody looked at him. That realization hit him hard. For years he believed status protected people. Connections. Appearances. Titles. Now he was discovering what real power looked like. And it wasn't sitting at his table. My mother grabbed Ava's arm. This can't be happening. But it was. Ava stared at the screen as though watching her future disappear in real time. Because she was. The lifestyle. The promises. The luxury. The fantasy Richard had sold her. Gone. Every minute brought another revelation. Additional records appeared. Additional witnesses came forward. Additional victims were identified. Retirement accounts. Small businesses. Family savings. College funds. The damage extended far beyond my family. That was what made the destruction unavoidable. Richard hadn't simply lied. He had hurt innocent people. People who trusted him. People who lost everything. Completely oblivious to the fact that his own arrogance had brought him here, he continued trying to explain his way out. Trying to argue. Trying to intimidate. Trying to reclaim control. None of it worked. The evidence was overwhelming. The ballroom doors opened. More officials entered. Richard noticed them immediately. The color drained from his face. My father slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Defeated. My mother looked lost. Ava looked shattered. And Richard finally understood something I had known for weeks. The game was over. The empire he built through deception was collapsing in real time. Every lie. Every stolen dollar. Every fraudulent promise. All of it crashing down beneath the weight of documented truth. I remained seated. Calm. Glacial. Watching. Not because I enjoyed the destruction. Because I understood the lesson. The truth doesn't need volume. Only timing. As officials approached Richard, I glanced toward my family. They looked broken. Confused. Terrified. What they didn't know was that tonight wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. None of them saw what was coming next. None of them saw what was coming next. The gala ended before midnight, but the consequences continued for months. That is the thing about truth. People imagine it arrives like thunder. In reality, it often arrives like gravity. Slow, unavoidable, permanent. Within 72 hours of the gala, regulators froze multiple accounts connected to Richard's operation. Investigations expanded across several states. Additional victims stepped forward. New evidence surfaced almost daily. The fraud that once looked sophisticated now appeared embarrassingly obvious. His empire collapsed piece by piece. Then all at once. 6 months later, Richard stood in a federal courtroom wearing a tailored suit that could no longer hide what he had become. The man who once mocked my profession now depended entirely on attorneys. The irony was almost poetic. His assets were seized. His companies dissolved. His reputation destroyed. Bankruptcy followed shortly afterward. The applause he once craved had been replaced by silence. As for my father, his downfall was quieter. And somehow more painful. For years he measured people by status, connections, and appearances. He spent decades chasing rooms where powerful people gathered. After the gala, those rooms stopped opening for him. Invitations disappeared. Calls went unanswered. Conversations ended quickly. I watched him realize that borrowed status vanishes the moment the source collapses. The lesson humbled him more effectively than any argument ever could. My mother faced a different consequence. Social isolation. Many of the same people she once impressed with stories about Richard now avoided her entirely. Church gatherings became uncomfortable. Community events became awkward. The woman who constantly demanded loyalty discovered how fragile transactional relationships really are. Without attention, she seemed lost. Without influence, she seemed smaller. Without an audience, she had nothing to perform for. Then there was Ava. The golden child. The daughter everyone protected. The daughter everyone chose. The daughter who believed success could be inherited through proximity. For months, she searched for another shortcut. Another Richard. Another fantasy. None appeared. Eventually, reality arrived. She accepted an ordinary office position earning an ordinary salary. There is nothing wrong with honest work. The tragedy was that she had spent years believing she was entitled to avoid it. Watching her learn accountability felt like watching someone finally meet themselves. As for me, my life moved in a completely different direction. The trust my grandfather created allowed me to expand my consulting firm nationally. New offices opened. Scholarships were funded. Financial literacy programs launched in underserved communities. The same money my family expected to inherit after my death became the foundation for opportunities that helped countless people build better futures. That mattered more than revenge ever could. Some evenings, I still sit beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment and watch city lights flicker beneath the night sky. The room remains pristine. The silence remains peaceful. But I am not the same woman who stood outside that dining room door listening to people plan my future. That woman wanted acceptance. This woman requires only truth. If you're listening to my story, remember something important. Family titles do not guarantee love. Approval is not the same thing as respect. And the people who underestimate you often reveal more about themselves than they do about you. My dark skin was never the problem. My success was never the problem. Their blindness was the problem. For years, I carried loyalty like a burden. Now I carry wisdom instead. And wisdom weighs far less. The moment they planned my ending, they unknowingly wrote my beginning.